Good morning, everyone. I'm Jen Frazier. I get to work at the NCAA in the Division I governance office. And Ben is with me here. We are sitting across the conference table from each other. We had our own technology challenges this morning. So we appreciate the opportunity to be with you and to engage with you again this year. I'm going to share, I think, well, I was going to try and share a PowerPoint, but it doesn't look like it's going to let me.
You should be able to us.
You go to settings.
Share. Allow share. It says multiple participants.
It's not the same.
If you go to participant list, it'll
I do
give
this
you
all the time.
opportunity.
There you go. You go to security.
I don't think I'm the main one, but okay.
You go to security.
Ben and I can we can just get started, and if it comes to us in a minute, we can catch ourselves up. But we did want to start by way of a timeline, and I think we've talked in previous years about the transformation that intercollegiate athletics has experienced and continues to experience. And on the other end of a transformation committee and the opportunity to have President Charlie Baker now fully on board, we wanted to just sort of follow on the timeline, which brought us to this point. And we've started to think about that with starting in the spring of 2020, when the COVID pandemic was introduced to our universe, and acknowledge that it impacted all of us in our own ways and in our own industries. And it really caused us to rethink the way that we operated, where we would spend years and years studying an issue and really contemplating what the right answer was. That the COVID experience required us to be changing and thinking and revising almost immediately. And that's really sort of given us a springboard into being more nimble and acting and reacting and trying to get out in front of things, as opposed to taking the opportunity to study over a course of a few years. Throughout the remarks that we'll offer this morning, and then give opportunity to engage with you all, there was a theme that has emerged, and it's a theme that's been part of the values of the association that has really taken root, and that was the opportunity and the influence that student athletes have in using their voice and their advocacy. And if we think back to another earth-changing event that happened in the spring of 2020 with the murder of George Floyd, Division I, II, and III student athletes banded together and said, we have a set of core values and a core set of expectations, and we are going to make those known. And they really, really sort of harnessed that power and influence that had long been there. But it was a galvanizing event. And so when we were working toward providing a healthy and safe environment for institutions of higher education to both teach and develop young people, and also give the opportunity to participate in sports. And so we worked throughout the summer and the fall. We started to have intercollegiate competitions again, and we reached March of 21. We were having a basketball tournament that was previously canceled. The men's and women's basketball tournaments were those events that were canceled in March of 2020, and had extraordinary economic impact on our intercollegiate athletic industry. That men's basketball tournament and other championships are economic drivers for the opportunities that are provided. And that cancellation, again, really caused us to rethink where our values and our priorities were. So we were going to play basketball again. The women were playing in San Antonio and the men were in Indianapolis. And it was a real opportunity to show how an event could be hosted and provide a safe environment in the midst of a pandemic. And again, a student athlete put on public display gender inequalities that existed. And it resulted in the immediate declaration that an external review would occur, and it would be about men's and women's basketball and all of the other championships. And in addition, it resulted in a report that allowed for the association to consider recommendations that would result in systemic change, how we operated in the office, how our committees went about making decisions. That gender equity review began in April of 2021. It resulted in a phase 1 report that was followed by a phase 2 report, and the division and the association and the office started to work through those recommendations. Then just a few months after that, the United States Supreme Court issued a ruling in Alston versus the NCAA. You have what appears to be a good agenda. I'm sure you're going to dig into some of the effects of that ruling, so I'm not going to dive into it. But it again was this opportunity for the association to say, what did we learn from this case and what do we need to do differently? In addition, the state of California took legislative action, largely without concern for what it was going to do to the national landscape. And we had the activation of name, image, and likeness opportunities for student athletes. Other states quickly that followed thereafter. So following the Supreme Court ruling, we had started a Constitution Committee, and this is where we pick up where we were together about a year ago. So the Constitution Committee did really important work for the association, offered clarity for what the association was going to be. What were those areas that were important and necessary for all 3 divisions? And then where did each division need to set its own course in alignment with its philosophy and principles? So the Constitution did its work. There was a vote last January of the entire membership, and concurrently, each of the 3 divisions started in on the work that was before it. In Division I, that was the Transformation Committee. There were really 2 iterations of Transformation Committee recommendations. The first was in August of last year, and it focused in 3 primary areas: fair and timely infractions processes. It created transfer windows in an attempt to stabilize the landscape. And then it was the result of what we learned through the Supreme Court decision that we decentralized the regulation of Bylaw 16, which is awards and benefits for student athletes. We took those out of the national regulation level and deferred to institutions and conferences about what student athletes needed. That was the first round of recommendations. The second round of recommendations was in January. It was the final report of the Transformation Committee. That committee no longer exists. It has done its work. It has moved on. And that final report really focused in 4 primary areas. It continued on the fair and timely NCAA. Fair and timely by way of regulations, fair and timely by way of decisions in the infractions process. Fair and timely was a big component of that. It established membership expectations. It asked the question, what does it mean to be a Division I institution into the future? And it set out a series of recommendations about what that meant. Those recommendations are now being developed into actual legislation and policy, and we should see those come through the structure for action here in the next 6 to 9 months. Those member expectations, it's really important, connecting back to the theme about student athlete advocacy. Those member expectations started with a presentation by the Division I National SAC about a uniform set of experiences that student athletes expect, regardless of the level of division or the sport that they play. And those were really the foundation that set about creating those specific recommendations. It set a series of recommendations around enhancements to the championship experience. Those experiences are intended to be the pinnacle of a student athlete's participation in intercollegiate athletics. And the Transformation Committee identified a series of recommendations that would elevate those to that level and meet the stated purpose. And then lastly was the student athlete voice. There were a series of recommendations that have now been acted on. I'll touch on that in just a few minutes, but the student athlete voice was a big part of the development of those recommendations and resulted in 2 pieces of legislation to enhance the voice and advocacy.
You want to share this? You should be able to share screen now.
Okay. I hope that Kendall's able to join you later. He should get a lot of credit. You should give him a lot of credit for the work that he did and the voice that he shared at the Transformation Committee table that resulted in those recommendations. And then finally, a new NCAA president. So Governor Baker joined the association in March, and we are now able to share the priorities that he set forth for the association since his arrival. So yeah, I'm getting a funny thing on my laptop. So I'm not, well,
Okay, we won't worry.
so really quickly, let me just talk a little bit about NCAA commitments. Next week, there's a Division I Board of Directors meeting, and they are set to consider a proposal that would create what's called the holistic model. That's how you'll see it and have probably seen it referred to previously. There are commitments that the association has long held, and it is attempting to put behind those commitments actual legislation. And this is, they fall in the areas of health and safety, academic support, which Ben will talk about in just a couple of minutes, individual development of the student athlete, and again, continuing that voice and advocacy of student athletes. So in the health and safety area, it's important to note that that's a comprehensive statement, the commitment to the health and safety of our student athletes and those people who support the student athletes. So it's mental health, it's physical health. We've got a series of recommendations about coach education in an effort to ensure that student athletes are properly supported during their time. Individual development of student athletes. This includes things like life skills, relevant training, career preparation, both while they're a student athlete and a former student athlete who comes back and says, you know, I need help, institution. I don't know how to do this, or I need, you know, tap into the network that you have available. And then I mentioned the voice and advocacy. There was a legislative proposal that was adopted last week by the Division I Council that created expectations about the inclusion of the student athlete voice in the decision-making structure at the conference and institutional levels. That exists largely at the national level already, and it looks to mirror those at each level within intercollegiate athletics. And also, for the first time ever, we have a group of student athletes who have raised their hand to be advocates for their experience. They are eager to involve themselves in the congressional conversations, both at the federal and the state level. They are learning how to take part in those activities. And this is really the first time that we've got a group of student athletes together who have volunteered to take on those opportunities. So I'm going to turn to Ben to talk about the academic success and priorities. She may be able to figure out how to share PowerPoint slides better than I, and then we'll return back before we open it up for questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Can folks see this?
Yes. Yes.
Great. Good to be with you all. As Jen mentioned, as well as Kelly, my name is Ben Nguyen. I've been with the national office close to 17 years and oversee Division I academics. It's good to be with you all again. It's great seeing folks last year, and sorry we couldn't be there in DC with you this year. As Jen mentioned, we just wanted to touch base and provide some insights, perspectives on the academics, which I know you all are keenly focused on. And as Jen just walked through, as you can hear from her, it certainly is a dynamic and ever-changing landscape. However, as folks have continued to reinforce to us, and we are also keenly focused on, is the academic success of our student athletes. And you'll see here on this slide is that we continue to graduate our young men and young women at high rates. 90% was what was released this past November. This is the entering cohort of 2015. So as many of you know, it is a 6-year graduation rate. And you'll see the chart on the bottom left-hand corner of the slide is because of the initiatives, the effort, the time and energy, the folks on campus, yourself, as well as our advisors, our FARs, our tutors have dedicated their time to ensuring our student athletes are graduating. You'll see we've made significant strides in certain populations of our student athletes. Some well over 20% graduation rates. So there's a lot of great news, a lot of celebration we should continue to do, as our efforts certainly has produced what we have intended to do, which is to make sure our student athletes graduate and be integral parts of society moving forward. Flipping the page.
90%.
That's huge.
90% is great.
It is, and that's when you think about it, and I try to think about in terms of 9 out of every 10 student athletes are graduating. We also recognize that there are probably other strides we can make in certain populations other than what is listed in the bottom left-hand corner. Certain sports, certain populations of student athletes, and I think a combination of keeping our eye on the ever-changing landscape, as well as perhaps more targeted efforts, such as what we've seen in the football rule with the 9-hour rule, as well as the wrestling academic enhancement proposal package that went into place this past year, can certainly pay dividends in the years to come.
Is this within 6 years?
It is, you do have to
90%
graduate within
within
6
6
years, and then you report out the year after. So we just opened the portal for the 2016 entering cohort.
Ben, do you know the general student graduation rate, the non-student athlete graduation rate?
I do not have that off the top of my hand, but when I turn it over to Jen, I'll see if I can pull that up quickly.
I have a question also.
No, it's not 90.
It's not 90, there's no way.
Do we know what the impact of the extra year of eligibility COVID had on these numbers?
The question is, do we know the impact the extra year COVID has? We do not yet, because we still have, I do believe, 2 more years of the individuals that did receive that extra year. We are tracking on it. We also are seeing and hearing, and you're probably seeing it social media, some are opting out of playing that extra year.
Yep.
So there is a lot of dynamics for us to flesh through before we figure out the dynamics. And also, it probably does have a significant impact on the transfers, as well as we're hearing the slots are also not available to incoming freshmen. Those coming out of high school may not have as many opportunities as they had previously because of the extra year.
Ben, I want to ask a question. Are you finding a significant percentage of athletes who leave and return to complete their degree?
The question is, are we seeing student athletes leave and then come back?
Yes.
We would have to take a look at the data. Anecdotally, we have not seen a droves of student athletes come back. And I only say that through some of the degree completion offerings have been at the same levels that they've had been in the past. What we are seeing, and is really interesting, is that we are seeing more student athletes that are leaving with more than 1 degree than we have previously, mainly because of the extra year. In addition to the continued accumulation of credits in the summer, whether it's summer access, we are seeing many coming in with more AP courses credits than they previously had. So they're starting off as sophomores. So we're seeing that trend as well, which has accelerated graduation, leaving in 3 years with 2 years left, which has become more the norm as of late.
So Mark just Googled the overall student completion rate. Progress in the national college completion rate has stalled. The 6-year completion rate for the fall of 2016 cohort was 62.3%, essentially unchanged from 2015, 62.2. The flat line follows the gain of 1.2 percentage points in the preceding year. So we were going up a little bit, and now we're stagnant at 62. So college athletes do better.
I think that has been the headline for the last few years. It will be interesting to see, and I know the Committee on Academics, as well as our research staff, is interested in, once we get to the point where we are reporting the years of that were impacted by COVID, how those student athletes have fared.
Very interesting. Sorry, go ahead, Ben.
All right, I do have one more slide that I wanted to go over, and we'll turn it back over to Jen. Is as she emphasized, is our landscape is ever changing. You'll see here on this slide 5 bullet points that we are tracking on, more in terms of how they will impact the impact of our young men and young women in terms of their academics. A lot more pressures all at once rather than isolated pressures. So COVID-19 pandemic, Jen mentioned that we are learning how to educate our young women and men differently, whether it's more virtual courses, time in the classroom may be different. You all know that best. Or how grading has changed,
At
perhaps.
the bottom right, did that already. Right, speaker icon in the lower right corner.
I'm gonna mute her, sorry.
You can mute her.
Yeah.
Is we've had courses that went from a grade to a pass fail, more flexibility in terms of what is considered passing a course. So we are tracking on that, and that's not solely at the collegiate level. We're also seeing that at the high school level. I know Jen will touch on NIL opportunities. There is interest from the community on academics with NIL and tracking transfer activity. We are trying to figure out how best to collect that information. So we are making informed decisions based on data. Many of you are aware, we did eliminate the test score from initial eligibility. Certainly, many schools are keeping it in place for admissions purposes. However, we have eliminated from initial eligibility. We've had the blanket waiver in place for the last 3 years due to COVID, where prospects were unable to find testing locations due to COVID. We also were tracking on the trend in higher ed, where schools were moving away from the use of the test score for initial eligibility. And lastly, before I turn it over to Jen, is always has been important is how we continue to support our limited resource schools and HBCUs. There is, whether it's through a grant program we have here with the Accelerating Academic Success Program, our staffs are going to campus to best assist institutions, these types of institutions in terms of helping their student athletes in the academic realm.
Ben,
So I'll stop. Yep.
This is Joan. You just mentioned a couple seconds ago that you had courses went from graded to pass fail. What were you talking about exactly for them?
What we saw and what we continue here is you would get a grade A, B, C, but some professors just went to a pass fail, which in some cases may help a student athlete's GPA, or in some cases may hurt a GPA. So we saw that trend of just increased flexibility, just given the pandemic. And some institutions, some professors have kept that practice in place, while others have reverted back to their normal grading of courses.
Okay, thank you. And this is Amy from Duquesne. I have another question. I feel like since they initiated the I'm using the wrong word, the compensation payout to if you meet the GSR or the APR, I feel like since that, there's also been a stronger effort on keep getting for at each individual schools to make sure they keep their APR points and get their GSRs up so they can get that piece of the pie. So I would consider that as a potential confounding factor that we might want to consider as well when we're looking at the academic priorities and some of the changes recently in the landscape. Are you guys considering that?
That's a
Have you
great
talked
point.
about it?
That's a great point, Amy. For folks that aren't aware, This is year 3 of the distribution for institutions that meet a certain benchmark in APR, GSR, or Fed grad rate. That is also something we are tracking on. And also in 2 years, based on the board's direction to reevaluate the criteria. But that has placed additional emphasis on the academic success of our teams in terms of APR as well as grad rates.
But it may be helping.
Oh, I think it is. That's
Yeah.
why I'm at, when we talk about the changing landscape on the academic performance, I think that's also a potential player.
It's a carrot. right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
I like that.
absolutely. We've spent a lot more effort at our
The
institution.
stick doesn't seem to work, but the carrots can.
Ben, this is James Williams from University of Tennessee. The transfer portal, transfer activity, I can see the pros and cons for student athletes when they're looking to have opportunities in their sport. Do you think it's more helpful or hurtful to their graduation opportunities when they transfer to these different universities?
I think that's a good question that we have not been able to answer with data since we have yet to have multiple years of this transfer activity in the most recent 5 sports to be able to determine the impact of transferring on student athlete academic performance and graduation. Anecdotally, probably many of you have heard on campus, and you've seen this with your current students, is that multiple transfers does potentially delay ultimate graduation because of what
We are doing the closet.
is transferable to the next school, those types of things. But as that last bullet mentions, we are trying to collect that data to see if multiple transfers or even one transfer does impact academic performance, or if there's a certain profile of student athletes that ultimately lends itself to graduation within 5 years, those types of things to help us inform any future policy. That's a good question, James, that is on our radar.
Thank you.
All right, let me turn it over to Jen and she'll walk through the remaining slides.
Thanks, Ben.
I think
Other
I'd like
questions?
to ask everybody to mute.
Thanks all. Just a couple bits of additional information to share. The first, we've referenced it a few times throughout, which is the introduction of the NIL opportunities for student athletes. It's really important for us to acknowledge and celebrate the great aspects of NIL and what is being those opportunities and the creativity of student athletes. So it's really important that we start with that. Throughout the conversations around NIL activities, and since they have come into our stratosphere, and since Charlie Baker has started on the job, there's been this development of these opportunities where we think either legislating through the traditional, how we talk about it, NCAA legislation, or working with Congress to achieve federal legislation, which would stabilize the environment and work to eliminate the state by state aspect that we're working with right now. And those are in the following areas: consumer protection. In this case, in the reference here, the consumer in this case is the student athlete. So it's working to ensure that the opportunities that the student athletes have through NIL are protected. They know what they're getting into, they understand the value and the benefits, and they understand what they need to be mindful of. That lines into financial literacy. A lot of work around financial literacy is already happening. Institutions have amazing programs, professional organizations have really good programs. The national office has a program that's free of charge that institutions and student athletes can use. That exists today, but creating that as an expectation is something that has been identified to help stabilize the environment. A uniform standard contract. This is something that would allow for awareness across the board about what is included in these contracts, and then agent registry and certification. So we know that student athletes are using agents for their NIL activities. Agents are getting a lot of airtime if you're reading media reports about the activities that they have in the landscape. They're really important advisors to student athletes, both in the NIL activities, and then of course, if any of them choose to go professionally, either in athletics or another form. And so it's important to know who the agents are, that they have the right information. We have a certification program for basketball coming out of the Commission on College Athletics for those men's basketball student athletes who want to explore professional opportunities but retain their collegiate eligibility. That exists today. It's something that could be explored to be scaled, but agent registry and certification. We also hear about a national database where we could understand and have visibility to the deals, and it would answer some questions about the market rate. That continues to be a topic of conversation and a topic of interest to the membership about how we could look to stabilize the environment.
Jen, can I make a quick comment going back? Peter Schoenthal with Alliance, we do a lot of NIL compliance and data sharing and education. The biggest thing that I see that I think is really important that you put up there is the agent registry and certification, which is not getting enough quote unquote airtime. One of the big issues in the space is the lack of review and the lack of transparency around athlete representation. And you all are really hamstrung by these states that are now creating state laws that are creating advantages that are very weird, but no one's overseeing the agents. And so seeing that and seeing that the NCAA is interested in looking at that is very important, because there hasn't been a single state that has done one investigation into NIL infractions, and they all have the ability to regulate agents. And there's no place for athletes, parents, or schools to go see whether or not an agent is someone that's certified in a league or went to college or law school. So I think that's really important, and it's really great to see.
Thank you, Peter. And you know, they're lucky to have you today and learn from the expertise that you offer. Before we turn it back over to you all and give you the opportunity to ask questions and share with us, let me just cover the additional strategic priorities that have been developed and released by Charlie Baker. The media rights negotiation, this is something that started, we knew the contract was coming up, and so it's been ongoing, but we are active in this now. And this particular media rights, this is about the non-domestic men's basketball, non-domestic men's basketball and men's and women's golf. So it's all the other sports and championships that are included in this particular package. We are currently engaging in a study of the media landscape to determine opportunities that exist. The second is student athlete mental health. Again, this has been referenced throughout, but our student athletes in all three divisions have said mental health is their number one priority. That I understand. Not telling you all anything you don't know. That is not unique to the student athlete population. That is consistent for young people across our states. So this is something that the association is really committed to determining how we can support the student athlete mental health initiatives. And then lastly, this is very internal, but a business performance review. Charlie Baker has identified a consulting firm that is conducting a business performance review about the association, looking for ways that we can be better at our jobs, be better at serving and providing service and leadership to institutions that are part of the association. That report is expected in mid-July, and then that will give us an opportunity to identify areas of change. So Kelly, we'll stop there. Happy to spend a couple of minutes taking questions. I understand that you all have a big agenda before you today, so we will try to get you back on schedule. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely presentation by both of you. And I wanted to ask a little bit about the financial literacy program, because this is something that I have long thought that there are pockets of strength, like right here, and they are not known by all the colleges. So I like it when you say you've got a free one. That's especially good. And then even if there were a pool of schools that have programs, could maybe describe their program and put it, on a web page, and then schools that don't have a program could learn about them. And I would love if the NCAA did a carrot for financial literacy for our athletes, because that is so important for them. But, actually now they should have it in high school, really,
Everywhere.
really. But we can't do anything about that. But yeah, I just think this pool of knowledge and sharing between colleges even, I've tried to get them over to Hawaii, and my athletic department, there's always an excuse, but yeah, so anyway, I just want to applaud you on the free training, and then if there's any way you could pool knowledge and share it, that would be outstanding.
Jen, I've got a question, Jerry at the University of Alabama. So you, throughout this presentation, and if you go to the NCAA website, you have, one of our the NCAA's front and foremost goals is safe and healthy student athletes able to thrive not only in college, but in years beyond. And I'm interested in your take or your thoughts on the ability to make sure that NCAA institutions are providing an appropriate number of athletic trainers to each of their student athletes. So we have a lot of rules. The NCAA has a lot of rules and regulations on you've got to have this number of that and that number of this. And if you don't meet this, you're in an infraction against the NCAA, and you have nothing of that sort for athletic trainers. So I would love to see that step be taken. I think it's the only way that many institutions will take appropriate and adequate steps towards providing that type of care and safety. And we have a blueprint for it. We know how to calculate for appropriate numbers. The NATA has the appropriate medical coverage for intercollegiate athletics. And the recommendations from that are actually things taken from NCAA best practices statements. So I'd just like you to address that. And I know that the immediate thing is going to be, well, that costs money and we can't make institutions spend money. But at some point, the health and safety of our student athletes has to be number one. And we know the best suited group of people for that is the certified athletic trainer. So thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And you're right. You don't need me to provide any answers. You've just laid out the landscape. Let me though spend just a moment talking about the Transformation Committee, because it had very similar conversations. And it ran the gamut from the ratio that has been suggested to something that is a little bit softer. And it's this idea of trying to determine appropriate coverage for student athletes participating in intercollegiate athletics. So it didn't land on the recommendation of a ratio. Talked about, expectations around attestation. And then really it came out as a what it meant for appropriate coverage of events and practices and where student athletes were participating. And I'll drop that segment of the report into the chat before Ben and I depart and let you get on with your day. And that's being developed. That recommendation is being developed. And now is the part where I am going to say to you, you know more about this than I do. There is, through the Sports Science Institute, the plan for a summit in June that will bring together representatives from the athletic training associations and leaders and decision makers in each of the 3 divisions to have a conversation about the challenges. Because what we often hear is sometimes about, that's going to cost money, but we also understand that we are in this period of time where the educational requirements associated with becoming a certified athletic trainer have been modified, and we're catching up to that. It may not be, this is anecdotal, it may not be as desirable a position anymore because of the hours and because of the salary that it once was. And so we're finding certified athletic trainers taking opportunities with clinics or in other places that provide and that need the services and the expertise that they have. So there's this sort of confluence that we need to have this conversation. And maybe it is about, you know, you need to figure out how to pay more in order for it to be attractive. We need to figure out how to hire more positions so that the hours aren't as astronomical. But that's the first part of the conversation. So I appreciate you asking. I will drop the recommendation that came out of the transformation committee that's currently being developed into the chat, so you have that language. And then we expect that that recommendation will come forward, and that's in that category of membership expectations. So thank you.
Can I add one more thing? I asked this last year too. Can you please update the sports medicine handbook on the website? It's still saying the only one that's available is the 2014-2015 handbook. Thank you.
And there's a request to show the first slide of the priorities with the agency, with agent registry at hand again. Could you please show the first list of priorities with agent registry at the end? I think that was the last slide. Yeah.
Ben's last slide.
Jen, these are just suggestions. Because I know a lot of universities, financial literacy, mental health, they're trending topics, but a lot of stuff come out to be more performative to me. So I would love for you to really get them to really focus on what financial literacy really look like, not just the retirements with your company and organizations, but really go into investments. What is the difference between savings, real money management, needs, wants, how you can really break your money down and really spend it in those type of ways. Real estate properties, LLCs, nonprofits, because a lot of students really ask these questions, but they don't really know how to dig deep into that. And I find myself teaching students how to go out and invest on their own on certain stocks and shares and things of that nature. Mental health, I would really love to see transition assistance programs, you know, that's really focusing on identity crisis, but also how to reintegrate themselves into society. Because I see a lot of students that really struggle with that. I was speaking earlier about a friend of mine that contacted me 2 years ago and asked, do I miss the game? And I was like, no. And I asked him and he said he missed it every single day. And he's 38 years old. And he had a very successful career in sports and things of that nature, but he don't see how he really fit into society. And I think we need to do a better job of that, because some of the programs I have seen where they're talking about how you can use what you did in sports and things of that nature, but I don't think it's really diving deep enough into the psyche of a student athlete. And I think that's it's very alarming, especially when you look at the average life expectancy of some NFL players and NBA players. You know, and I think NFL is like 55, and you know, a lot of that is not physical, but some of it is mental shutdown. So I think we need to look more into those things to make it more robust.
But I think a lot of that has to do with the universities, right? And the way they educate on some of these things. There are a lot of classes where athletes can take those, but they're not pushed that way from their athletic departments, right? I don't know if that's an NCAA issue. And then the other thing is, we've seen situations where the NCAA has mandated certain education. And then what the schools do is to check a box, they bring all 300, 500 athletes into an auditorium with one speaker, and then they expect all 300 to 500 kids to tune in, right? And I don't mean to say kids, but student athletes. So I think a lot of those issues aren't on the national office and more on the institutions, where they need to get out of the way of checking boxes and actually educating. And that's what we see is a bigger issue. They're more concerned sometimes with showing on social media they're offering these classes, rather than breaking it down and having 20, 30 athletes in a room and educating that way. So I don't know if that's a national office, because they do mandate a lot of this stuff.
And no, and I didn't think it was the actual NCAA that is not pushing it. I just would love for them to have a presence that put more pressure on the universities. Because what I am seeing in universities is the more performative nature.
Yeah.
And I just didn't know if they had the power to put more pressure on the universities to do that. So that was my thought.
So this is the NCAA's, it looks like Invesco is doing the training. And so maybe you can take a look at this and see what you think. And maybe, I mean, we can always make recommendations and, you know, to
I
improve
think
it?
though we should discuss later, amongst the institutions, what is your institution
Yeah.
doing?
Yeah.
So at the
Yeah.
University of
Yeah.
Tennessee, they have, and I'm not familiar with the details of it, James, you may know more about it than I have. They partnered with the Haslam College of Business to create an entrepreneurship minor that is aimed at NIL.
Yes.
I know Sue has a question. Go ahead, Sue.
Thank you so much. Sue Doe, Colorado State University. I'm very happy to see the advocacy around student athletes that I'm hearing here, particularly in terms of mental health. I want to know whether the Transformation Committee has recommended that there be long-term responsibility of colleges and universities for covering the expenses related to the health, particularly mental, but also physical, of student athletes after graduation.
Thank you. It's good to hear your voice this morning. I referenced that next week, the board of directors is going to have the opportunity to act on a piece of legislation that's referred to as the holistic model. And a component of that includes the coverage of out-of-pocket expenses for student athletes for athletically related injuries that are sustained while they're participating, and extending that for 2 years post eligibility. So that's the commitment that exists today for some institutions, but this would make that a requirement for all Division I institutions. That's the proposal that's come forward. And so that's what the board will have a conversation about next week.
Thank you.
Ben, I have a question about graduate assistants. You know, a lot of student athletes are continuing on to work towards a master's degree, but they want to get experience with helping coach on the field. So there's some rule the NCAA has that in order to be able to coach on the field, you have to be a graduate assistant that's going to classes. Can you say a little more about that? Because I just learned about that in an athletic council meeting at LSU.
The rule that Joan is referencing is that in some sports, they do allow for graduate assistants to be in a sort of like a internship fellow coaching position so that they gain real life experience coaching, whether it's X's and O's, recruiting, conversation with student athletes about playing time, those types of experiences. There is a whole list of requirements that need to be met. One of them is that they do need to be a full-time graduate student at your institution. There's a certain amount of time you must have or may not have departed the institution, those types of requirements. I think football has it, several other sports have it as well.
I was just wondering why doesn't the athletic department just hire them as an employee? Can they do that, or they have to be a graduate assistant going to
Well,
school?
I think that's a good question, Joan, is that they would fall into the employee bucket, and then you would have all these whole host of other benefits, requirements that need to be met as an employee, for example, at LSU. They wouldn't have to be enrolled in courses. This was solely just an attempt in some sports to primarily grow the pipeline for future coaches, to gain the experience so that they could put this on their resume and then potentially go to another school or stay at the same school and be a coach. You certainly can do that as an employee. However, it just, depending on the bucket, comes with a different set of requirements.
Thank you.
So, Jim, this is probably for you. This is Greg Gardner from the University of Tulsa. We talked about transformation committee and everything. Did they deal with the issue of Power 5 football and how that's going to change things?
The question and this might be better for Jen, is whether or not the transformation committee discussed and maybe I'm paraphrasing this, is how they are going to address how we govern Power 5 football.
Correct.
Jen, do you want to chime in?
So there were a couple of acknowledgements that came out of the transformation committee conversation. The first is the commitment to the big tent. And this idea that the goal of the transformation committee was not to extract members from Division I, but it really was about determining what we need to do to be Division I and to continue to work together under the big tent. The second aspect to acknowledge is that there are some experiences of student athletes that are different. Not better or worse, but different. The rowing championship is here in Indianapolis in the middle of May, and there won't be 100,000 people at that event, right? But there are 100,000 people that show up to Jones campus 6 Saturdays a year, right? So the experiences are just different. And what do we need to do to acknowledge and support those differences? So it isn't specific to autonomy football. It is acknowledging that some experiences that student athletes in certain sports have are different than others, and we may need to figure out a way to support that differently than we do for other student athletes.
I think it was Mike that asked for.
Kelly, you're muted.
Am I muted?
Yes, on your computer.
Oh,
Yeah.
but can you hear me? The room, okay. Should I unmute here? Am I gonna echo? Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I was just saying that I think it was Mike who asked for the slide. And let's see, when discussing the holistic model next week, will the board consider the mental performance literacy as a way to get athletes, coaches, athletic trainers, etc., on the same page, as a way to be proactive in athletes' approach to mental health? Did I get that right?
Well, you read it as the same as I read it. And the reason I didn't respond is I don't understand the question.
Okay, we got some clarification. Approach to mental health literacy. Oh, it's Eva.
Yeah, it's Eva. Sorry,
Oh, go ahead.
I was late jumping in here because I had connection issues.
Yes,
hi,
we
everybody.
all, it's not your fault.
Thank you for everyone's help. So yeah, I'm excited about this priority. Of course, it's very important, as we've heard across the board. But so my background is in sports psych, and when we talk about holistic model, we tend to approach just the holistic model aspect of mental health and mental performance literacies as kind of being on a continuum. That's a model that's been put forth by the Association of Applied Sports Psychology. And so just, jumping in here, I'm a new FAR at USC, and I've kind of, I haven't been part of the whole process and conversation. So I want to preface it with that. But the idea that we're focusing on mental health and being kind of like a reactive and in a way, anticipatory reactive approach, I think could be augmented if we kind of had some discussions about ways to be proactive by focusing in on mental performance literacy. And there's a difference, but there are similarities as well. Of course, mental performance is to try to get, athletes and coaches and even referees to be able to perform at their best under high stakes situations and be able to self-regulate some of the emotions that are part of athletics. And what, we do in the profession of sports psychology on the educational side, we teach skills like mindfulness, relaxation, goal setting, et cetera. And a lot of those are similar to some of the interventions that occur on the other side of the spectrum when it comes to mental health interventions, clinical and counseling types of approaches. And so my thinking on this is that if we can expand our conversation and think about this broadly and have everyone on the same page, there's one point that I noticed education for coaches is going to be a priority as well. And so some of that education could maybe focus on the mental performance literacy. And in that approach, ideally in this perfect world, we could have less stigmatization of folks and less misdirection when coaches are referring athletes to services that they may want or need. So that's kind of a long-winded explanation of what I was thinking about in my comment. So I'm wondering if you can address some of that. Is there any talk about mental performance literacy?
So thank you. Congratulations on your appointment as FAR. We look forward to working with you. I want to just clarify that my language around the holistic model is that it's inclusive of 9 areas, and mental health and safety of student athletes is one of those areas. So then the reference in the proposal is that institutions adhere to the mental health inter-association guidelines that are created out of the Sports Science Institute here at the national office. There are current inter-association guidelines on mental health that are available. As I understand it, they are going through a significant overhaul, and I appreciate your point about mental performance literacy. I'll flag that for them to see whether that's going to be part of the guidelines into the future. So it isn't necessarily holistic in that, but there may be holistic within elements of what we are referring to as the holistic model for student athlete benefits. So thank you. I appreciate the reference to mental performance literacy, and Ben and I will share that with our sports science staff that are working on those revised mental health inter-association guidelines.
Thank you so much.
Other questions?
Jen, this is Amy from Duquesne. You just said inclusive of 9 areas. My academic background of being a student far too long, I take notes. I don't have 9 bulleted. Can you just run through those 9 areas for me?
Not off the top of my head.
That's fair. We didn't get it was probably on your slide. That's no work. That's fine.
It wasn't. It
Okay.
wasn't. But I can get that to you all.
That's fine. I just was trying to put together a report, and that 9 areas might be a nice bullet for me to summarize. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. We are going to need to excuse ourselves. I know that you all, it looks like you might be delayed in your agenda as well. Are there is there a final question or comment that you want to share or ask before we excuse ourselves?
I would like to commend the 90% to
Yes.
everybody. 90% graduation rate is outstanding. It would be great if they can come back and take more courses, but I was at the Drake group meeting on Tuesday, and I heard some athletes say, I just want to get out. And then some athletes say, I'll stay as long as they'll pay for me to take courses, and I'll get my master's and my PhD. And so everybody is different. But the fact that our athletes graduate at higher rates does say something for the benefit of athletics to the athletes. And then we know their benefits to the other folks too. So I'm glad you're addressing the mental health. This is just so prevalent in our society today. And I'm glad the athletes are saying, help me.
Yeah.
Because they did not used to say, help me. And so I'm glad we're listening. We know we need more athletic trainers. We know we need more money for athletic trainers. And so I'm glad this holistic, it's not holistic is not something I've ever heard describe the NCAA. I'm sorry, but it's a wonderful new idea of helping their financial literacy, helping their mental health, helping, you know, the whole thing. And so I'm so glad, Sue, we've got another FAR on the COIA too. So I think the more we're all working together, whether it's for financial literacy, whether it's for mental health, I mean, I just think it's so exciting to be talking about it, working together to help our student athletes. So thank you. We'll hear more later from Kendall. We're not actually afraid of being behind schedule, but we will let you go because we don't want you to be behind schedule. So
We
last
very much
question.
appreciate the invitation and being with all of you. And if we can do anything to be in service, don't hesitate to reach out and wish you all the best on your day of sharing and learning. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.